There is a particular kind of silence that only exists in the moment before someone realizes they have made a terrible mistake. Not the silence of waiting rooms or empty churches, the silence of a room that holds its breath because it knows something the person standing in the center of it does not. That was the silence that filled the interior courtyard of the Aoyama estate on the evening of the 14th of March. And every single person present could feel it settling into their bones like cold water, except for one man. His name was Brendan Cole, and he was laughing. He had been laughing since the moment the car dropped him at the gate, laughing at the lanterns strung through the maple trees, laughing at the white silk ribbons wrapped around stone pillars that had stood for over 200 years, laughing at the guests arriving in cars that cost more than most people earn in a decade, guests who spoke in quiet voices and moved with the unhurried certainty of people who have never needed to rush because the world has always waited for them. And most of all, he had been laughing at the invitation itself, the heavy cream paper, the gold ink, the name written in both English and Japanese, Naomi Reeves, and guest. He had not been the guest. He had not been invited at all. He had shown up because, in his mind, the entire evening was a performance staged for his benefit, and he intended to enjoy every moment of it. If you have ever loved someone who turned their back on you at the worst possible moment, stay with me, because this story is not really about what happened that night. It is about everything that had to happen first. Naomi Reeves had met Brendan Cole when she was 26 years old and newly arrived in Tokyo on a one-year contract with an architectural firm. She was the kind of woman who moved through the world carrying a quiet intensity, the sort of person who notices which buildings cast shadows on their neighbors, who hears music in the rhythm of rain against concrete, who remembers the names of people everyone else forgets. She was talented in ways that made her colleagues uncomfortable, and humble in ways that made her easy to dismiss, and for a long time she had not understood that those two things were connected. Brendan was charming in the specific way that only very shallow people can be, with an ease that comes from never having had to think carefully about anything. He was handsome and loud, and he made Naomi feel, for a brief and dazzling season, that her quietness was something he treasured rather than tolerated. She found out the truth the way most people find out the truth about someone who has been hiding it, not all at once, but in small, accumulating moments that she kept explaining away until she could not explain them anymore. Naomi did not cry. She did not make a scene. She sat very still and watched it happen, and felt something inside her go completely quiet. Not the quiet of surrender, but the quiet of something that has just made a decision it will never unmake. She was let go from the firm 3 weeks later, not because anyone believed Brendan over her, but because staying would have required everyone to admit what they had seen, and no one wanted to do that. She stayed in Tokyo. That surprised people. Her mother called from London and told her to come home. Her friends told her to move somewhere Brendan could not find her, as though she were the one who had done something wrong. But Naomi had come to love Tokyo in the way you can only love a place that does not care whether you are there. A city vast enough to hold your grief without asking you to explain it. She rented a small apartment in Yanaka, a neighborhood old enough to remember when the city was still mostly made of wood and paper. She took freelance work. She ate alone at the counter of a ramen shop where the owner never asked her questions. She rebuilt. And it was there at that ramen shop on a Tuesday evening in November, 2 years after the dinner that had ended everything, that she first spoke to Kenji Aoyama. He had come in out of the rain. That detail matters because everything about Kenji in those early months felt like a counterpoint to what Naomi expected. She had expected someone like him to be dry. She had expected someone who ran one of the oldest and most feared criminal organizations in Japan to be unreachable, impenetrable, surrounded at all times by the careful architecture of power. Instead, he was soaking wet, carrying a broken umbrella, and arguing quietly with himself about whether the soup he had just ordered was too salty, which it was not. He was in his mid-40s. He had the kind of face that had been lived in rather than decorated. And when the owner introduced them, because the owner introduced everyone, that was simply how he was, Kenji looked at Naomi with an attention that felt neither threatening nor performative. He simply looked at her as though she were a person, which had been rarer lately than it should have been. They did not become close quickly. That also matters. The story of Naomi and Kenji is not a story of instant chemistry or dramatic declaration. It is a story of accumulation, of Tuesday evenings at the ramen counter becoming a standing arrangement, of walks through Yanaka in the early spring, when the cemetery there fills with cherry blossoms so thick you can barely see the stones, of Kenji asking her once very carefully what she had been before she came to this neighborhood, and Naomi telling him the truth without softening it, and Kenji listening without offering her a single piece of advice she had not asked for. He had his own version of that story. He did not share it immediately, but she could feel its weight in the way he listened to hers. What she knew about him she had learned in pieces, that his family name was one of the oldest in the Kanto region, that the organization he led had operated for generations under a code that most outsiders misunderstood entirely, structured around loyalty, obligation, and a particular conception of honor that had very little to do with legality and everything to do with keeping promises. That he had been married once before, briefly, to a woman who had loved the idea of his world without understanding what living inside it actually required, and that the separation had been quiet and without bitterness, and had left him with a scar he wore the way he wore everything, with composure that did not pretend the wound was not there. She did not love him because he was powerful. That is important to say plainly, because the version of this story that Brendan Cole eventually constructed for himself required her to have been motivated by money or safety or some transaction of security. None of that was true. She loved Kenji because he had looked at her when she was at her most invisible and chosen to keep looking. Because he argued about soup. Because he had once spent an entire afternoon helping her find a specific shade of grey for a renovation project she was working on, visiting hardware shop after hardware shop with a patience that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with caring about what she cared about. Because he made her feel for the first time in longer than she could trace that her quietness was not a deficit to be managed, but a language someone had finally learned to speak. He proposed on a Tuesday evening. The ramen shop was closed. The owner had retired, which had saddened both of them more than seemed proportional. They were standing outside the shuttered door, and Kenji had reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, and he had asked her in a voice that contained no performance whatsoever, as though he were simply stating something he had verified and found to be true. She had said yes in the same register. And then they had gone to find somewhere else to eat, because the moment did not require anything larger than itself. The wedding was planned for March. Naomi had designed parts of the ceremony herself, the way the lanterns were strung, the placement of the silk ribbons, the angle at which the courtyard would catch the last light of the afternoon. It was a small wedding by the standards of the Aoyama family, which meant roughly 80 guests, all of whom were either family or people whose relationship to Kenji was so deeply layered with history that they constituted something beyond friendship. The ceremony would be conducted in both English and Japanese. There would be no press. There would be no announcement until after. These were conditions Naomi had set, and Kenji had agreed to them without question, because he understood that she was still in the process of trusting the world again, and that the world had not yet fully earned it. What she had not anticipated was Brendan. He had apparently run into a mutual acquaintance, a woman named Priya, who had once worked at the firm and who had not known, when she mentioned offhandedly that Naomi was getting married in Tokyo in March, that Brendan would take that information and do anything with it. But he had. He had researched the name Aoyama with the specific focused energy of someone looking for a reason to dismiss something. He had found references to the family, vague ones, the kind of references that exist in certain publications and certain whispered conversations, and he had constructed from those references an entire narrative about Naomi that served his own purposes perfectly. In his version, she had attached herself to an old crime family. She had found a patron. She had traded whatever authenticity she had once possessed for a life funded by someone else's darkness. He told this narrative to anyone who would listen in the weeks before March, and then, because he could not resist the audience, he got on a plane. He arrived at the Aoyama estate in a car he had rented specifically because it was flashy, wearing a suit that had not been pressed properly, carrying the energy of a man who expects a confrontation and has rehearsed his lines. The gates were open. Guests were still arriving, and the staff at the entrance, who had a list of names and a very clear sense of who was and was not on it, had been instructed by Kenji's head of security to let him through. Not because he was welcome, because Kenji had been told he was coming and had made a decision about how to respond that Naomi did not know about until later. Inside the courtyard, Brendan moved through the guests with the confidence of someone performing confidence, which is a very different thing from actually having it. He accepted a glass of sake he did not finish. He made comments, under his breath and then not under his breath, about the display of wealth, about the seriousness with which everyone was treating what he had decided was theatre. He found Priya near the eastern wall and said things to her that made her step away from him. He looked for Naomi, but Naomi was not yet in the courtyard. She was inside with Kenji's sister, having her obi adjusted for the third time because the first two adjustments had been wrong, and because getting it right mattered to her in a way that had nothing to do with appearances and everything to do with the fact that she was choosing, deliberately, to honor the ceremony she was walking into. Then the doors opened. Not the doors through which Naomi would enter, the doors at the far end of the courtyard, the old ones made of hinoki cypress that had not been opened for a gathering since Kenji's father's funeral. They opened slowly, and the sound they made was the sound of something that does not open often, a deep resonant complaint of old wood and old iron, and the guests who had been speaking turned toward the sound and went quiet, and the quiet spread across the courtyard like water finding its level, until the only sounds were the lanterns moving in the slight evening wind and the distant call of something in the garden beyond. Kenji Aoyama walked through those doors. He was wearing a Montsuki Haori Hakama, the formal black kimono of a Japanese wedding ceremony, and he wore it the way he wore everything, with an absence of self-consciousness that made it seem less like clothing and more like a natural extension of what he was. He was flanked by two men who moved with the particular stillness of people who have spent their lives making sure nothing unexpected happens, and behind him, at a respectful distance, came four more, older men, men whose faces carried the kind of history that is not discussed in polite settings, men who nonetheless bowed their heads as they crossed the threshold in a gesture of genuine deference to the space and the occasion. The Aoyama name moved through the courtyard ahead of him like a current. The guests who knew it straightened slightly. The guests who did not know it felt the change in the air and straightened anyway. Brendan Cole had gone very still. He was standing approximately 15 meters from the doors, and he had a glass in his hand, and he had stopped mid-sentence in whatever he had been saying to the person nearest him. His face had passed through several expressions quickly, recognition, recalibration, something that was trying to present as composure and not quite managing it. Because Brendan had done his research, and his research had told him things. It had told him about the Aoyama family's history, about the scope of their reach, about the specific, particular, absolute nature of the loyalty that surrounded that name in certain rooms, in certain cities, across certain very large distances. He had known this when he got on the plane. He had known it when he rented the flashy car. He had told himself that it did not matter, that he was simply coming to witness, that he had nothing to fear because he was not involved. And standing here now, watching Kenji Aoyama cross the courtyard of his own home with the unhurried certainty of a man who has never needed to announce himself because the room has always already known he is there, Brendan understood, with a clarity that arrived very late and did very little good, that he had made several significant miscalculations. Kenji's gaze moved across the courtyard with the deliberate patience of someone reading a room they have read 1,000 times. It paused briefly on Brendan, not with hostility, not with warning, not with the theatrical menace that Brendan had been half expecting and half hoping for, because at least menace would have been legible, would have given him something to react to. Instead, Kenji looked at Brendan Cole the way you look at a chair someone has left in an inconvenient place, noting its presence, determining it requires no immediate action, moving on. That look lasted perhaps 2 seconds. It was one of the most devastating things Brendan had ever experienced, and no one else in the courtyard was aware it had happened. Then Kenji reached the center of the space and turned and looked toward the inner doors and waited. And Naomi came through. "If you are still here, and I hope you are, I want you to stay for this part, because this is not the part of the story about Kenji's name or his history or the weight carried by the men who had walked through those cypress doors behind him. This is the part of the story about a woman who had spent 3 years rebuilding something that had been taken from her, and who had rebuilt it so completely, so carefully, so honestly, that what she walked into that courtyard carrying was not a performance of recovery. It was the real thing. She was wearing a shiramuku, the pure white wedding kimono, formless and total, the white of something that contains all colors rather than none of them. Kenji's sister had spent 40 minutes on the obi. The kanzashi in her hair were old, borrowed from Kenji's grandmother's collection, lacquered wood and small silk flowers in the red that in Japanese tradition means luck and life, and the kind of love that is not decorative. She walked slowly because the ceremony required it, and she kept her eyes forward because that was what she had decided, and she did not look at Brendan Cole because he was not the reason she was here and had not been the reason for anything real in a very long time. But she knew he was there. Of course she knew. Kenji had told her that morning quietly over tea that Brendan had apparently decided to come, and he had asked her, not whether she wanted him removed, not whether she was upset, but simply whether there was anything she needed from Kenji in order to walk into that courtyard, feeling exactly as she intended to feel. She had thought about it for a moment. She had said no, and then she had drunk the rest of her tea. The ceremony was conducted by a Shinto priest who had known the Aoyama family for 30 years. The vows were exchanged in both languages, promises made twice, which felt right, which felt like the kind of redundancy that was actually emphasis. Kenji's voice was steady and direct. Naomi's voice was steady and direct. The courtyard was so quiet during the exchange that the lanterns could be heard moving, and somewhere in the garden beyond the old cypress doors, something was still calling, low and unhurried, into the gathering dark. Brendan Cole stood at the edge of the assembled guests and did not move. The man beside him, a quiet man in a dark jacket, who had positioned himself at Brendan's left shoulder sometime during the ceremony without fanfare or introduction, had said nothing. He had not needed to. His presence was itself a complete sentence. After the vows, after the sansan kudo, the ceremonial sharing of sake from 3 cups of 3 sizes, 9 sips that bind 2 people to each other and to the world they are making together, Kenji turned to the gathered guests with the expression of a man who is exactly where he intended to be. And he spoke briefly in Japanese first and then in English, about what this evening meant to him, about what Naomi meant to him, about the particular and specific nature of a love that had been constructed carefully between 2 people, who had both learned the hard way what it costs to trust someone and what it is worth when that trust turns out to have been placed correctly. He did not look at Brendan during this speech. He did not need to. Every word of it was a kind of answer to every assumption Brendan had made on the flight over, in the rental car, at the gate, in the courtyard. Not a defensive answer, not an aggressive one. Simply the truth offered to the room, which is the only audience that matters. When Kenji finished speaking, there was applause, warm and real. The applause of people who are genuinely glad to be present, rather than obligated to perform gladness. And in the movement of the crowd that followed, in the shift from ceremony to celebration, in the sound of conversation resuming and music beginning somewhere to the left of the lanterns, Brendan Cole found himself standing entirely alone. The quiet man in the dark jacket had moved. The guests had redistributed. The warm center of the evening had located itself precisely and unmistakably around the couple at its heart, and Brendan was at the periphery of it, which was the only place he had ever actually occupied in Naomi's life, though it had taken him until this courtyard on this evening to understand that plainly. He left before the first toast. No one stopped him. No one needed to. The gate opened when he approached it because of course it did. The staff had been told it would, because Kenji Aoyama was not a man who needed someone to stay in a room to demonstrate his own weight. Brendan walked to his rented car and sat in it for a long time in the dark outside the walls of the estate, listening to the faint sound of music and voices carrying over the stone. Whatever he had come here to take from this evening, whatever satisfaction he had imagined, whatever diminishment of Naomi's choices, whatever confirmation of the story he had been telling himself for 3 years, none of it was available. The evening had not been structured for his experience of it at all. Inside the courtyard, Naomi was dancing. Not formally, not ceremonially, but the way you dance when someone you trust has taken your hand, and the music is exactly right, and the lanterns are moving, and the night has turned cold in the way that cold can be beautiful when you are warm. Kenji was not a particularly skilled dancer. He had told her this in advance, and he had been accurate, and she loved him for the honesty, and danced with him anyway. His grandmother, who was 91 years old and had been watching from a chair near the eastern wall, said something to the woman beside her, and the woman laughed, and the grandmother laughed too, and the sound of it moved through the courtyard like something that belongs there. Kenji's sister found Naomi some time after midnight, after the guests had thinned and the music had gone quiet, and the lanterns had burned low. She handed her a small envelope, cream paper, no markings, and said that it had been left at the gate. Naomi opened it. Inside was the original invitation, the one on heavy cream paper with gold ink, the one that had gone to Naomi months ago and that she had not known had been intercepted, rerouted, delivered to Brendan as some kind of joke about what her life had become. He had brought it with him and left it behind. Whether this was a gesture of concession or bitterness, or simply the disposal of something he no longer wanted to carry, she could not entirely read. She folded it once and held it for a moment. Then she handed it to Kenji, who looked at it and then at her, with the expression of a man asking a question without words. She shook her head slightly. He nodded and put it in the inside pocket of his kimono, and that was the end of it. Not a dramatic end. Not a confrontation or a monologue or a public accounting of everything that had been taken from her and rebuilt. Just the end. The clean, quiet, final end of something that had run out of the power to matter. Here is what I want you to hold from this story, not as lesson, but as truth. There is a version of recovery that looks like returning to who you were before the damage. And there is another version, harder, stranger, more honest, that looks like becoming someone the damage made possible. Naomi Reeves had not returned to the woman she was at 26. That woman was gone. And grief for her was real, and the grief had done its work and was done now. The woman who had walked through those inner doors in white silk, who had made promises in 2 languages, who had danced badly and laughed genuinely, and held an envelope in the dark without crying, that woman had been built from the ruins of the other one. She had been built in a ramen shop in Yanaka, in the company of someone who argued about soup and cared about the right shade of grey, and asked her what she needed, rather than telling her what he thought she should want. Brendan Cole flew home 2 days later. He told the story of that evening in a way that minimized what had happened to him, which is the only defense available to someone who has seen clearly, for the first time, exactly how small they are. Over time, the story changed, softened, shifted, rearranged itself into something he could live with. Stories do that, when the truth of them is too specific to bear. But here is what did not change and will not. Naomi woke the morning after her wedding in the Oyama house, in a room that smelled of hinoki and old paper, and the cold morning air coming through a window that had been left open. Kenji was already awake, sitting at the low table near the window with tea, reading something unhurried. When she came and sat beside him, he poured her a cup without being asked, and she drank it, and the garden outside was very still, and the light was the flat, clean grey of early March, and somewhere nearby something was beginning to wake up and call into the quiet, and she felt, not triumphant, not vindicated, not proved right about anything in particular, she felt very simply that she was where she was supposed to be. That is what the best kinds of love produce, not a feeling of having won, a feeling of having arrived. If this story meant something to you, consider subscribing so you never miss the next one. Stories like these are why this channel exists, and every person who stays until the end is part of why we keep making them. Drop a comment below about the moment in this story that hit hardest for you. And if you know someone who needs to hear that rebuilding is possible, share this with them. We will see you in the next one.